Hey, Steve, what's the situation there this hour?
Well, the scene continues to be dramatic, but not because of the people. Those have been cleared out. This is essentially over. You are now looking at what's left of the encampment. You may be able to look over and see what's left of the police force. They appear to be leaving. This primary action has been completed. Overnight, police came in hot and heavy. What's left over is what you see, just sort of a mess of graffiti and leftover materials and debris and, frankly, garbage. Now, of course, it's cleanup, but before then, it was hours long of a struggle, police battling with protesters using flashbangs, pulling apart this encampment, essentially piece by piece, very quickly, very swift police action, very decisive, because all of a sudden this went from a camp teeming with hundreds of protesters for about a week to absolutely nothing. Police do say it was mostly efficient, in meaning that almost no injuries, save for the officer that you mentioned. They used non-lethal methods to do that, and they said their biggest concern in making arrests and tearing down this camp was to do it slowly to protect the protesters. I spoke to an officer who said that was absolutely part of the mission. Yes, to disable this camp. Yes, to disassemble this camp, but also yes, to do it safely for peaceful protesters, especially to continue to do that without harming anybody. And, you know, to most of my knowledge and to the people who were here, they did that pretty efficiently, Anna.
So Steve, you know, the images have been striking. Police tearing down those barricades, arresting protesters. What do we know about those who were arrested and some of the tactics police used?
So we know it's well over 100 people, right? I think last count, it was over 130. So a lot of people arrested. This was a dramatic night with dramatic action. The protesters, especially the hardcore set when you got down to it, really wanted to fight back. They were not leaving without a fight. There certainly was one. In fact, the last protesters we saw here, as I can kind of continue walking through this, they fought back pretty hard. And it got to a situation in which after they pulled down, you know, everything from this encampment, including the plywood that served almost as armor, they had to forcefully pull people out sort of one by one by one, and able to do that without injury, I think is amazing. Just suffice to say, did it by non-lethal means. It looked like they had long guns. None of that stuff was actual weaponry, okay? That was just what they had to do as far as flashbangs and sort of pellet rifles to get in here and do the job.
All right, Steve Patterson, thank you so much for that reporting. Please keep us posted. And joining us now, Donnell Harvin. He's the former chief of Homeland Security and Intelligence for the District of Columbia, and he oversaw the district's operational intelligence in response to the insurrection at the U.S. Capitol on January 6th. Donnell, it's great to have you here. If these university presidents were to call you for advice on de-escalation, what do you tell them?
I would tell them not to allow what happened at UCLA to happen. Now, in all fairness, every jurisdiction and every college campus has their own reality. They're based in different jurisdictions, different laws and statutes. How law enforcement approaches civil disorder is different from every department. However, what we saw in UCLA is quite different than many of the other demonstrations we've seen. What we saw were protesters with counter-protesters, and nobody keeping them apart in the middle.
That was yesterday.
That was yesterday.
And so we've had 2 days in a row now of these scenes of confrontations and clashes. Yesterday, protesters, counter-protesters. Today, it was police and these protesters.
Correct. And so what happens is that when you allow counter-protesters and protesters to commit interpersonal violence, that really ratchets up the violence level. And so when police finally do come in, they're coming into a situation that's fraught. They don't know who's going to be attacking them. They don't know who to pull apart. And that's why the deliberate measures that the police took to make sure they protected protesters were exactly what I would advise. But to let it get to that point, I think it was a point too far.
And so there is this sort of philosophical question that I think a lot of universities are trying to grapple with, and that is, where is that line between protecting a right to protest, protecting those First Amendment free speech rights, and maintaining campus safety and preventing harassment and hate speech?
Yeah, people send their children to college not to have to deal with harassment, hate speech, and sometimes violence. And each campus has a different threshold. It's based on whether it's a public or private campus, right? So public institutions have probably a higher threshold because it's public space. And many of these activities are First Amendment protected activities. However, you can't do First Amendment protected activities in private space. And so those campuses really have to tackle with how much they're going to allow. Certainly, taking over buildings, and doing a lot of the things we saw at Columbia and some of the other institutions, Fordham University, that's not protected by the Constitution. And so that's when they ask police to come in. The question is are you working with law enforcement in advance? Do they know the tactics, techniques, and procedures that are being used on the ground? Mayor Eric Adams talked about that today and yesterday extensively about some of the agitators. Are law enforcement aware they're coming in cold? And that's the difference.